The young men themselves felt probably the pressure to fill the gaps and to go to war. Once you got out of the trench into no man's land, essentially you were on your own. It was a terrible, terrible place where terrible things happened. And he said to the workers, "These soldiers were killed once, please don't kill them again." I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. This week we're going to do life rather than crimes. We're going to talk about a story that comes from wartime, from more than 100 years ago, from World War I. It's a story about a pair of brothers, one of the many sets of brothers who went off to war, both in that war and in World War II. In fact, whole families sometimes went to war, entire groups of brothers, sometimes fathers and sons, sometimes uncles and nephews, at a time when obviously mostly it was the male members of the families that went to the war, although, as we know, some women went to nurse the wounded. These brothers were from Queensland. Their names were Jack and Jim Hunter. They came from a little district called Nanango, which is close to Kingaroy, and that means it's a bit more than an hour these days from Brisbane. But of course in 1916 and before that, it was a relatively long way from Brisbane because it was a long, slow trip to get there. And these young men, they were quite, I think, reasonably prosperous farmers. Their father had a good farm. They were the older brothers of a family of 7 children. Their mother, Emily, had died in childbirth in 1909 when these 2 young fellows were, young adults. In those days, people had big families and childbirth was a very dangerous thing. And their mother, having had 6 children safely, died having the 7th. These boys were, by 1916, men. They weren't boys at all. Jack was the oldest, John, but known as Jack, was turning 28 that year. And his brother Jim, who really was his best mate, was 25. They were about 2.5 years apart. And they worked with their father on the farm. They worked, not just farming, but as timber contractors, and they were energetic and successful people. Jack, the oldest, had a sweetheart, a girlfriend locally, and was intending to get married and settle down. He wasn't terribly interested in the idea of going to war. And of course, farmers in those days were, to a large extent, exempt from war service because the country did need the produce, that not only food, but all the other things that farms produced. But his younger brother, Jim, was keen on the idea of serving God, King and country, as many young men were. He was fired up by patriotism. He was also fired up by something else that not so many people talk about, but clearly was a potent thing, and that was the hunger to see the world. These were youngsters who really probably had never been beyond Brisbane, had probably only heard about, other states and hadn't been there and would not get to other states except in exceptional circumstances, probably when they were middle-aged or something like that. And so the siren call of the war, it promised different things to different people. And a lot of young men saw it as a chance to get away from the humdrum, hard-working life of getting up at dawn every day to labour, essentially, and to see the world and to have adventures. And clearly that appealed to Jim Hunter. There also was something else with young men, particularly in World War I, to be seen to be young and fit and strong and not to enlist was to fear that you would be called a coward or a shirker. And as the casualty lists were published and came back to these country towns across Australia and country districts, parents would fear for their sons because they could see that people were getting wounded terribly and killed. But the young men themselves felt probably the pressure to fill the gaps and to go to war. And indeed, by 1916, given the collapse at Gallipoli and the high casualty rates, the authorities had dropped the minimum physical requirements quite a lot. Initially, they'd only wanted the most perfect specimens of young manhood to go to the war so they could be butchered. But now they dropped the minimum size to, I think, 5'3" or 5'3.5" or something, down from, whatever it had been, 5'6" or whatever it was. And it meant that basically anyone who wanted to go to the war could get there. Not that the Hunter brothers would have ever been knocked back. They were tall for their generation, for that era. They were both regarded as tall men. They were, closer to 6 foot than not. I think 5'10", which in those days made you more likely to be a ruckman than to be a rover. And they were well set up, strong, good types of guys. And when Jim went off in late 2016 to enlist, he was accepted immediately. And 2 days later, his older brother Jack decided that he too should go, as he put it to his father and to the rest of the family, to look after Jim. Now, this was something that happened with families. A lot of brothers and, even sons and fathers. You had sons who were 19 and fathers who were 39. They would join up together in the belief that they could look after each other, and that if the young one went, that the older one would go and look after them. Now, really, it's not a logical presumption, because when you got to the modern war that World War I was, bullets and bombs in a war that was so terrible and so deadly weren't going to differentiate between one person and another. There was no point thinking you could be looked after or minded or shielded by your brother or your uncle or your father or anyone else. Once you got out of the trench into no man's land, essentially you were on your own. And that's how it went for the Hunter boys, two brothers among hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, in fact, thousands of brothers who went off to war. They went on a troop ship, the Ayrshire, I think it was called. They went south and, the usual route, across to the west and to Fremantle, and then slowly to Europe, a trip that took many, many weeks. In early 1917, they got to England, and then they undertook 3.5 months of training in the south of England, which was a storybook place to be training for young men who, of course, had been brought up on English storybooks, as people were then. The storybooks were English and the place names were familiar because they'd read about them and heard about them from a very early age. And there they were in Mother England, as people then referred to it, training away up on the downs somewhere and living in tents and, probably going to the local pubs on Friday nights and all the rest of it, which is a lovely thing, but it didn't shield them from the brutal reality of where they were going. And where they were going, as we all know, was the Western Front. And the Western Front in northern France and Belgium, the area mostly known as Flanders, it was the most devastating battlefield in human history. It was worse than Gallipoli. Gallipoli, bad as it was, didn't have the casualty rate or the sheer numbers of casualties of the Western Front. And so these brothers, like so many others, so many tens of thousands of Australians and New Zealanders and troops from all over Britain and all over the Commonwealth countries, they were poured into this terrible sausage machine on the Western Front. And there, so many of them were killed, and so many of the others suffered terrible injuries. And those who didn't suffer terrible injuries were injured by gas and by the absolute fear of shells going off, so that they became mentally incapacitated. They suffered what we now know as PTSD, then known as shell shock. And so really no one who went to the Western Front in 1917 was going to come out the same way, even if they came out alive. These boys, the Hunter brothers, there they were in the 4th Division. Jim had been particularly adept at training. He was a quick learner, and his superiors liked him, and they attempted to promote him to, I think, corporal and then possibly to a sergeant, but he refused promotion because he wanted to serve with his brother Jack, stay together as privates, and so that's what happened. And they went off together as privates, and there they were in the front line near Polygon Wood. And Polygon Wood is in the Passchendaele district, which is in part of Flanders, just over the border from northern France, where the worst of the fighting had been happening for many months. And there it was in this year of 1917, which I think was the wettest year for decades. Men drowned, literally drowned in the mud, in the shell holes. Men and animals, horses and men would drown if they weren't actually blown to bits. If they were hurt a bit and fell into shell holes, they would be choked in the mud and they would just disappear into this soupy mix of blood and mud and misery. It was a terrible, terrible place where terrible things happened. And on the 26th of January, just 7 weeks after the Hunter brothers got there, a terrible thing happened to them. And what it was, just one of those million small things that aren't small to those that happened to. There was a shiny piece of tin, a piece of iron, out in no man's land. Now, whether it had been placed there or it had blown there or what, it doesn't matter. It was a shiny piece of tin. It would reflect the light, the sunlight, and it appeared to the officers in charge of the Australians on that bit of the front that this bit of tin was reflecting in the eyes of the soldiers as they tried to aim to shoot at the Germans, who were, several hundred metres away. And so an officer decided, as officers would, that this piece of tin had to be moved. It had to be retrieved or at least obscured so that it would not reflect in the eyes of the soldiers. And so he called up Jack Hunter for whatever reason. Why him, we don't know, but it might as well be him as anyone else. And poor Jim, his younger brother, Jim, who'd wanted to go to war, is looking at Jack, who hadn't wanted to come. Jack, who had a sweetheart back home in Queensland who'd wanted to get married, but had come all this way to be with his brother Jim. It was Jack who was ordered to go over the top, over the sandbags, out of the trench, and out into no man's land where really you just took your life in your hands as soon as you put your head over the parapet. And Jack had to zigzag his way out and crab his way out to this piece of tin to move it. And Jim's sitting in the trench, waiting and listening to see if he can hear what's happening. He can't actually see safely. And after some minutes, he hears this massive explosion, one of hundreds, of course, but he hears one close to them. It's a mortar, a German mortar, and it goes off very close to them. And he thinks, oh my God. And next thing, Jack staggers back over the sandbags and into the trench. He's bleeding. He's grey. He's riddled with shrapnel. His body is just torn apart with shrapnel. And at first, probably his brother would think that perhaps he could be saved. And it is said that he put him on a stretcher and dragged that stretcher himself back behind the lines, back and back towards some sort of field dressing station or field hospital where he got his brother Jack. But Jack was dying, Jack was bleeding, Jack was severely injured inside. And after some time, Jack died in his brother Jim's arms. And then, of course, there was only one Hunter brother, the one who'd wanted to go to war for the great adventure, the patriotism, the one who'd wanted to avoid the accusations of shirking and cowardice. There he was, holding his big brother Jack, the person that he probably loved more than anyone in the world, his best mate, because they'd lived and worked together as brothers did in those days in country areas on farms. The person you would know best is the sibling who was closest to you in age. You'd know them far better than anyone else. So he lost his brother and his best mate, not really a father figure, but someone terribly close to him. And what he did, this practical Queensland farm boy, broken-hearted as he was, he got a rubber ground sheet and he wrapped Jack in it, and he got some signal wire, that was the fine, soft wire that they use for signals, and he used it to sort of stitch together the ground sheet and to wrap it around his brother securely. So he made a really neat parcel in which to bury brother Jack. And then there were a handful of other soldiers that had been killed or died at the same time. There was at least 4 others. There's some talk that there were a total of 7, but there were at least 4 others, we know that. And some other soldiers were there, and they and Jim dug rapidly and hurriedly a wide, shallow grave because the Battle of Polygon Wood was raging on. There was no time to waste. It was dangerous to have your head up where the bullets and the shrapnel could get you. And so they dug down, not too deep, probably 2 or 3 feet at most, and they put the bodies in. Now, the other bodies were naturally just laid down in this mass grave, but Jim was careful to separate Jack from the others. He moved him a little away from the other 4, and he turned him the other way around. Now, I suspect that the reason he did this was very practical. He wanted to differentiate Jack from the others in the grave so that when he returned after the war, as he swore to do, he would know how to pick which one was Jack, because time would go on and they'd just be reduced to skeletal remains. And so he made sure that Jack's body stood out from the others in every way. After they filled in the grave, he took careful note of the terrain, the landscape. He noted that the grave was near a bend in this particular road near this little village of West Hoke, which is a sort of a farming hamlet which was then smashed to bits probably in this part of Flanders near Polygon Wood. And he thought, well, if I survive, I can come back after the war. There can't be many more months of this. And then I'll retrieve Jack's body and I'll take him home to my father in Queensland, because we promised to look after each other. And the least I can do for Jack and for our father and our dead mother is to take him home and bury him there with family and friends. And Jim Hunter did survive the war. He did survive the next terrible year, and he saw Armistice Day, and he would have celebrated Armistice Day and Armistice Night as my own grandfather did. He told me not much about the war, but he said that Armistice Night was a great time but very dangerous because the French criminals came out and hunted down the Allied soldiers who had pockets full of deferred pay, and they were spending up big in the bars and bawdy houses of Flanders, and many of them, sadly, were robbed and killed by gangs who used garrotes made of piano wire. And in fact, my grandfather told me that he survived Armistice Night because he had to outrun the French gangsters, which is a little postscript to the war. Jim, being the good athlete he was, had no problems there. He survived Armistice Day, he survived Armistice Night. He went into the camps where the Allied soldiers were kept after the war, pending repatriation to Australia. And true to his word, he went out to Flanders, to the right bit, and he went to West Hoke, and he walked out the road that he thought was the right road, which it was the right road, And he looked for the bend in the road that he remembered from about 18 months earlier. So this is, I think, March or April of 1919. And so 18 months have passed or thereabouts, and he's looking for Brother Jack. He's looking for the grave. And he can't find the bend in the road. The landscape is so altered. And he's looking around, and of course, in that time, instead of this devastated landscape with all trees just smashed and shell holes and everything, the local farmers have ploughed everything up and they've sown down fields of millet and maize and crops, and they've re-erected fences and they've repaved the roads. It's amazing how fast that it all happened. And as he looked around these paddocks of produce, of crops, he realises that the road does not have a bend in it anymore. It's been repaved. And what he didn't know was that it had in fact been repaved straight over the top of the grave that he's looking for. That the engineers had taken the bend out of the road and gone straight across the landscape because they had the luxury of doing that. But poor Jim Hunter had no idea really which bit was which, and within, several hundred metres he just couldn't tell. And so with a very heavy heart, his heart was, broken a second time, he retreated and he caught the troop ship back to Australia, and then he caught the train back to Brisbane, and then he caught another train out to the northwest, and he went home to the farm at Nanango and told his sad story of how he tried to retrieve Jack and couldn't find him. And that was just one story of so many stories like that, of brothers in arms who went to the war, and if they weren't both killed, sometimes in the same battles on the same day, if you can believe it, one would be killed and the other return, sadder and sorrier and perhaps wiser. And Jim Hunter had to be nursed in the local hospital. Nearly all the men came back with things wrong with them, if not physically, then mentally, but usually both. And he was nursed in the hospital. One of the nurses, I think the matron, was Esme Butler. She was a small woman who was attracted to this tall and troubled Anzac, Jim Hunter, who was a good-looking fella, but she slowly nursed him back to health and he felt better, and eventually those two got married. Jim Hunter, the farmer and returned soldier, married his hospital nurse. She loved children and animals, and so they moved out to the farm, and Jim and Esme had 6 children. And so to some extent, I think he had the children that Jack would have had. He had plenty of them, and established the Hunter family as a big family in that district, and they live on in Queensland and elsewhere in Australia. They bred up and did the best they could. I think they owned pubs later and farming land and contractors. They were quite a successful family. But Jim lived a long and productive life, he and Esme, and he reached the end of his days in the late 70s, I think 1977, when he was in his mid-80s. And towards the end, they say, he started to lose his mind a bit as his memory would wander, and it would wander back to his boyhood and, of course, to the war. And they say that in the last days of his life, he would wake up and he'd say, "Where's Jack? Where's Jack? Where's Jack?" Which is a very moving thing. And it moved the family a lot, those who saw it, such as one of his nieces, one of Jim's nieces. And it was that niece who, in 2006, 2007, heard the news from Flanders that after all these years, that a work gang digging up a trench across a road near the village of West Hoke in Flanders, had come across a grave, and in the grave were the remains of some Australian soldiers. They could tell from the uniforms and so on, the boots, that these skeletons had once been Australian soldiers. And luckily, the work gang didn't just continue working, because in those parts where there are so many remnants of the war, perhaps sometimes people digging to dig foundations or trenches ignore what they find. But the workers on this day in September 2006, they contact Johan van der Wal. Johan van der Wal is a remarkable person. Anyone who has visited the battlefields of Flanders, Polygon Wood and those districts that we hear about, full of war graves, thousands and thousands and thousands of war graves. They will probably have seen a cafe which is called the Anzac Rest. It's near Polygon Wood in what is called the Zonnebeek district in Flanders. And Johan van der Wal, I think he's a builder or carpenter by trade, but by preference, he's turned himself into an archaeologist and a war historian, so distinguished in his knowledge of tunnelling and trench warfare that he has co-authored books with quite eminent English historians about World War I. Such is his knowledge and his skill and his research. And it was Johan who was only a few hundred metres away in his shop when the trench was dug and these bodies, these skeletons were found. He was contacted. He rushed to the site, hoping to prevent any further damage to the skeletons. And he said to the workers, "These soldiers were killed once. Please don't kill them again." And he had to persuade them to let him have the time to retrieve the skeletons intact properly. And what he retrieved was 5 skeletons. Now, 4 of them were all pointing in the same direction and weren't in particularly good order. The fact that the road had been above them meant that the traffic, the weight of the traffic going over them repeatedly for many decades, for basically most of the 20th century, meant that those skeletons had been knocked about and crushed. But one skeleton was off to one side a little bit, which meant that in fact it had been put by chance between where the wheel weight would go on the road. This body was effectively under the centre of the road and therefore had not had the weight of traffic on it. And this was the one that was facing in the reverse direction from the other 4. And this one was very neatly wrapped in a rubber ground sheet. And this one, when Johan opened up the ground sheet, he looked directly at the eyes of this mummified body underneath. And the body, of course, was skeletal and it had shrunken, but the skin had gone leathery and to some extent the face was still there and the eyes were open and the sun reflected off the eye sockets. And he was touched and marvelled at this, and he was very taken with it. And because of Johan's work, they were able to retrieve the bones intact from these people, and subsequently they carried out DNA tests, and the experts back in Australia were able to identify the most likely candidates for these unknown soldiers because, of course, there were dozens and scores of Australians and New Zealanders and others who had vanished in battle, whose last resting places had never been found and whose names had been inscribed on monuments, but they didn't really have a gravesite. So now these 5 could be moved to a war cemetery, which they were. They were given individual headstones. And, of course, for a while, the headstones were blank or they were unknown Australian soldiers. But the DNA tests were great. Through the DNA tests of likely relatives, they identified 3 of them. One was a young man called George Calder. Another one was called George Story. And body number 5, as they numbered them, was Jack Hunter, identified because his DNA matched his niece, who by this stage was quite an old woman. And because of what Jim Hunter had done, the body was preserved pretty well. And so, although Jack Hunter was never taken back to Queensland as Jim had wanted, it was moved with the others to a Commonwealth War cemetery nearby, buried with full honours, full military honours. And now his name and those of the 2 others identified through DNA were inscribed on the headstones, which for the family members scattered around Australia was a lovely thing. And now we come to the modern part of our sad tale of the Hunter brothers. Johann van der Waal was so moved by this discovery that he had pictures of the Hunter brothers blown up, and he put them in his cafe, and he would tell this story to visiting Australians, of whom there are many. And soon, this is in the 2000 teens, soon sufficient visiting Australians were enthused by him with an idea that he called the Brothers in Arms Project. And between them, they came up with this idea that a statue should be erected to commemorate all brothers in arms who had gone off to war, family members who had gone to war, but that the Hunter brothers represented something, a bond that was true for all the brothers and fathers and sons and others who'd gone to war together. And so the Brothers in Arms Project was born, but to some extent it was just a lovely idea. What it needed to happen was a lot of organisation and quite a bit of money and skill and everything else. Now, this project got some legs. The Brothers in Arms Project got supporters back in Australia, and these people got moving and they decided to raise money, and they thought if they could raise enough money over enough time, they could commission a bronze sculpture with an eminent Melbourne-based sculptor, Mr. Louis Lohmann. And Louis Lohmann is a terrific sculptor in bronze. He has done many such commemorative works. And they asked him what it would take to turn the scale model into a full-size, life-size model of the 2 brothers, one holding the other in his arms. And they arrived at a price that would take, many, many, many months, a long time. And it would need, I think, 7 payments of $27,000, which, when you think about it, is probably very good value when you think what it is that he's trying to make, because it's a very complex and difficult thing to do. And that was good. They were confident, this group of voluntary people, that they could raise the funds by spreading the word to RSLs and everywhere else. And that was okay, but it turned out that they couldn't get any support from the Australian government, and they couldn't get any support from the Australian War Memorial, which was disappointing for them. And it was extremely disappointing to a Melbourne man, a Melbourne philanthropist called Bill Gibbons. Now, we'll talk more about the statue and the Hunter brothers, but first, let's talk a bit more about Bill Gibbons. Bill Gibbons was known to the sculptor Louis Lohmann because Bill Gibbons is a philanthropist. He's a very wealthy former businessman. He had made his fortune in the transport industry, and he'd sold out. And unlike many people who sell out and make a lot of money, he decided to do good works with a lot of it. And it's Bill Gibbons that first came to public notice when, back in about 2007, the Rats of Tobruk Hall in Albert Park was auctioned, a very prime bit of real estate. And Bill Gibbons was more or less just a member of the crowd, and he put his hand up and he outbid the other bidders. And I think he paid $1.73 million for this little weatherboard hall in Albert Park. And the old people related to the rats of Tobruk were there, and they were sad because they could no longer gather there and use it. And the lady who used to look after the hall was there, and she was sad because it was the end of an era. And Bill Gibbons went up to them and said, "Don't worry, I bought it so you can use it. I'll let you use it as long as you like. As long as you need to use it or want to use it, it's yours to use. So you just go straight back in and keep looking after it," he said to the caretaker. "And you others, if you want to meet there or gather, do whatever you want to do, it's yours." And that's the sort of guy Bill Gibbons is. And he's gone on to do other things. It was Bill Gibbons who helped popularise the story of Bill the Bastard. Bill the Bastard was the great Australian war horse, a great, big, strong rogue of a horse that was sent across to the Middle East, to Palestine and Egypt in World War I with the famous light horseman. And Bill the Bastard was something like 17 hands high, which is big, and, just under 6 foot at the shoulder, which is a very tall horse. And he weighed in the more than 600 kilos, probably up towards 700. He was a big, strong animal, and he was also a rogue. He used to buck and play up, and in fact, only one man could ride him, they say, Major Michael Shanahan. And Bill the Bastard, I think, won the initial Jericho Cup. Now, the Jericho Cup was a race meeting held by the Australian Light Horsemen in the Middle East, near Jericho, funnily enough. And they ran this race meeting not only because it was an entertainment for the troops, but they ran it for a tactical reason. They thought that if the Turkish spies could see them running a race meeting, they wouldn't suspect that the Australians and the Allies were planning a raid. So they used this race meeting as a bluff. And they knew that all the spies would see them running this race meeting and say, well, you haven't got to worry about the Australians. They're busy having a race meeting, so they won't be doing anything much. And this race meeting was, in fact, a ruse. It was a very clever ruse to lull the Turks into a false sense of security before raids were undertaken. And Bill the Bastard ran in what they call the Jericho Cup, which I think was something like 3 miles, which is, close to 5 kilometres. And it was the headline event of a race meeting, which also included some other events, and 3 of those were won by a black thoroughbred mare called Midnight. And Midnight was ridden by a very fine Australian horseman from the Hunter Valley, a man called Guy Hayden. And Guy Hayden was from a horse breeding family near Scone somewhere. They had been breeding horses for about 80 years at that stage. They were very early pioneers of the Hunter Valley, and they bred a lot of very good horses. And Guy Hayden was a superb horseman, and his mare Midnight, he had brought her with him from the farm, and she was a terrific polo pony. She was a thoroughbred mare. She was clean bred. She could gallop, she could turn, she could stop, she could do everything. And Guy Hayden won 3 different events in the sports meeting that they held against the British, the cream of the British cavalry. And Guy and his black mare Midnight walloped the best of the British cavalrymen, which was quite a popular thing with the Aussies, of course. And just to finish off that story, at the charge of Beersheba, the famous charge where the Australian light horsemen took the wells of Beersheba from the Turks, they charged across open country, across the desert, and they charged for kilometres after marching for, I think 2 days without a drink, and an unbelievably brave thing to do, and a wild and risky thing to do, but the sheer riskiness of it helped them get away with it. And they charged the Turkish trenches, and they jumped the trenches with the Turks in them, with their sabres drawn and their rifles under their other arm. And as Midnight leapt, she was a fast, good mare. She was a thoroughbred mare, and she was well out in front of most of the Whaler horses. As she leapt the Turkish trench, a Turk shot up, and the bullet tore through her belly, killing Midnight. And the bullet was so powerful and so close, such close range, that it went through the mare right through her, and it hit the rider, Guy Hayden, just in his lower back, just where his back was hanging over the back of the saddle. It went and hit him there, but it had lost a lot of its sting because it had been through the mare's body. And so, although she died there, and although Guy Hayden was wounded, it didn't kill him. And the Australians won the battle at Beersheba, as everyone knows. And Guy Hayden, broken-hearted about his beautiful black mare, Midnight, who was dead, he was put in hospital. They removed the bullet from his back and he brought it back to Australia with him. And the Hayden family still have that bullet. And they still have many horses descended from the family of Midnight. Midnight belonged to a group of horses that the Haydens owned, and they still have that group, and they still breed a wonderful strain of thoroughbred horse that is used for polo and stock work. And they revere the memory of Midnight. And all of this is a long way of saying that Bill Gibbons was so taken with the story of Midnight and the wonderful story of Bill the Bastard. Now, Bill the Bastard, at the Battle of Romani, he was ridden by Major Michael Shanahan, and there were four Tasmanian light horsemen unhorsed. Their horses had been shot from under them, and these men were in great danger of being killed. And Major Shanahan yelled at them, "Jump on, Bill, jump on with me." And two got on behind him, behind Major Shanahan, and one of the Tasmanians got on each stirrup. And this great, big, brave horse galloped out of the battleground with 5 Australian soldiers clinging to him. And it was just one of the most wonderful rescues in any battle anywhere in history. And no one really could have pulled it off except this great, big rogue of a horse. He was brutally strong. He was half again as big as any other horse around, and he had enormous spirit and enormous natural strength. And he galloped and galloped and galloped and got those 5 men out and saved them. Major Shanahan later ended up in a wheelchair with a missing leg, but he never forgot Bill the Bastard, and the legend of Bill the Bastard lived on. And a few years ago, when Bill Gibbons heard about it, Bill Gibbons, the Melbourne businessman, the Melbourne millionaire, and the Melbourne philanthropist, he heard about Bill the Bastard and Midnight, and he said, "We can't let these stories go unrecognised." And he said, "We owe these people so much, them and the horses." And so Bill Gibbons has got behind a movement called the Jericho Cup, and he's revived the idea of the Jericho Cup. It's run in remembrance of that original race meeting held in, I think, 1916 in the Middle East. And it's run now, it's in its 4th year now at Warrnambool, at that wonderful country race course in Warrnambool, one of the great country race tracks, provincial race tracks anywhere in the world, I think. And it is there that the Jericho Cup is run, and it is rapidly becoming a fixture on the race calendar thanks to the generosity of Bill Gibbons, who has donated a large amount of money for 5 years to establish this race and a whole program of races, not just one race, but an entire day of racing, which this year will be held on Sunday, the 28th of November. And racegoers will flock back to Warrnambool post-pandemic to go back to the Jericho Cup, which opened successfully in 2018. I was lucky enough to be there. I thought it was wonderful. It was very moving. The Jericho Cup itself is run over 4,600 metres, which is a nod to the original. And they run for something like $300,000 prize money in the Jericho Cup itself. And it's only won by a very tough stayer, and the field trails off over, 200 metres. It's that sort of race. It's different from mainstream racing, which is sort of the point. It's more like a picnic race held by light horsemen in the Middle East in 1916. Also on the day's racing there's the Banjo-Paterson Cup, there's the Shanahan Maiden, there's a whole card full of races named after prominent light horse identities. And one of them, a race for mares, is called the Midnight Madness Dash. It is a sprint for mares only. I'm pleased to say that this year a group of friends and relatives and I have got ourselves a black mare who looks a bit like Midnight, and we're taking her down to Warrnambool for the Midnight Madness race. I doubt that she can win, but it's a pleasure and a privilege to go to a race meeting that celebrates the light horsemen and their horses. And it's all thanks to a man called Bill Gibbons. And there's no prizes for guessing that the person who put his hand in his pocket and paid for the big bronze statue of the brothers in arms, Jim and Jack Hunter, was Bill Gibbons. The big bronze statue, which as we speak is being loaded on a ship in Port Melbourne and will go to Europe over many weeks and will be set up eventually a commemorative park in Flanders, in the centre of the battlefields of Flanders, very close to Polygon Wood, very close to where Jack Hunter died and where his brother buried him. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is John Burton. And if you want to know more about these stories, links are in the description of this episode.